They had seen American jets before, many times. Joint exercises, simulated dogfights, carefully controlled encounters in international airspace. To Chinese fighter pilots, the US Air Force was powerful, but predictable, until one maneuver changed that perception. Not because it was loud, not because it broke any rules, but because, for a brief moment, it did something no one expected an American jet to do. And that moment didn't happen in a war zone. It happened during a routine military exercise, an exercise that was supposed to be safe. High above open water, multiple fighter jets moved into position. Everything looked normal at first. Chinese pilots maintained formation, sensors locked, distances calculated down to the meter. They had trained for this. The American aircraft ahead appeared calm, steady, almost passive. No aggressive movements, no sudden acceleration. From the Chinese cockpit displays, nothing seemed out of place. And that's exactly why what happened next was so unsettling. Because modern air combat isn't just about speed or firepower. It's about expectation. Pilots train their instincts around patterns, what an enemy should do in a given situation. And when those patterns break, hesitation follows. For decades, Chinese aviation doctrine studied American maneuvers closely. They analyzed flight paths, turn rates, energy management. On paper, they believed they understood how US pilots thought. But on that day, the American jet didn't behave according to the script. As the formation tightened, something subtle began to change. The US aircraft adjusted its position, not aggressively, not defensively, almost casually. To an untrained eye, it would have looked insignificant. But inside the cockpit, warning systems reacted. Angles shifted, relative speed changed. For a split second, Chinese pilots questioned their own instruments. Was this intentional or a mistake? Because if it was intentional, it meant the American pilot was seeing the engagement in a completely different way. And that possibility was dangerous. In modern air combat, confidence matters. The pilot who hesitates, even for half a second, is already behind. As the maneuver continued, Chinese pilots realized something unsettling. The American jet wasn't trying to escape. It wasn't trying to engage either. It was doing something else. Something designed not to attack, but to control the encounter itself. And that's when doubt replaced certainty. Not doubt in the aircraft, not doubt in the technology, but doubt in their assumptions. Because this maneuver wasn't in the manuals, it wasn't in the simulations, and most importantly, it wasn't something they had trained to counter. What followed would become one of the most discussed moments in modern military aviation circles. A maneuver so unexpected that it forced experienced pilots to rethink what they thought they knew about American air strategy. But to understand why it worked, we need to go deeper into how US pilots are trained to think, not just fly. To understand why that moment shook experienced Chinese pilots, you first need to understand how American fighter pilots are trained to think, not how they fly, how they decide. In US, Air Force doctrine, air combat is not treated as a series of isolated maneuvers. It's treated as a constantly shifting psychological contest. From the earliest stages of training, American pilots are taught something unusual. Sometimes the goal is not to win the fight, but to control the tempo of the fight. That difference changes everything. In many air forces around the world, pilots are trained to respond to threats in predictable sequences. If the enemy turns, you counter-turn. If they accelerate, you match energy. If they disengage, you pursue. These patterns are efficient, they're logical, and they're exactly what simulation software is built around. But American pilots spend years training to deliberately break those expectations. They are taught to ask a different question in every engagement. What does my opponent expect me to do right now? And then, if conditions allow, do the opposite. During the exercise involving Chinese aircraft, the US, pilot recognized something subtle. The Chinese formation was technically superior in that moment. Numerical advantage, sensor coverage, clear geometry. On paper, the American jet should have disengaged or repositioned defensively. Instead, it executed a maneuver designed to collapse assumptions. Rather than turning away, the aircraft altered its flight path in a way that appeared inefficient, slightly reducing speed, adjusting altitude at an unexpected angle, holding position just long enough to trigger uncertainty. This wasn't reckless, it was calculated. Inside the Chinese cockpits, systems reacted instantly. Targeting solutions fluctuated. Relative vectors changed too quickly to feel clean. For experienced pilots, that's uncomfortable, because when your instruments say one thing but your instincts say another, hesitation creeps in, and hesitation is deadly. What made this maneuver especially effective was that it didn't look dramatic. There were no flares, no violent turns, no obvious attempt to dominate. It looked wrong. And in air combat, wrong is often more disturbing than aggressive. The American pilot wasn't trying to force an engagement, he was forcing a decision. Either the Chinese pilots had to commit to an attack they weren't fully confident in, or reposition and give up the advantage they believed they had. Both options carried risk, and that's where doubt entered the cockpit. Because Chinese pilots are highly trained, highly disciplined, but their doctrine emphasizes control, structure, and clarity. This maneuver introduced ambiguity, and ambiguity is something no amount of technology can instantly solve. After the encounter, analysts reviewing the exercise noted something unusual. There was no single moment where the Chinese pilots lost, no clear tactical failure. Instead, there was a moment where they paused. A pause so brief it wouldn't matter in most situations, but in high-speed air combat, it matters a lot. That pause is what American doctrine aims to create. Not chaos, not panic, just enough uncertainty to seize control of the encounter. And that realization spread quickly among those who studied the incident. Because if one maneuver could create that level of doubt in a controlled exercise, what could it do in a real confrontation? That question would soon echo far beyond the pilots involved. What happened next never made headlines. There was no official press release, no dramatic footage released to the public, no statements pointing fingers. But inside military circles, the implications were clear. After the exercise concluded, both sides reviewed the encounter independently, flight data, cockpit recordings, decision timelines, and one detail stood out. The American pilot had executed a maneuver that technically reduced his immediate advantage, yet gained something far more valuable: control. By breaking the expected rhythm of the engagement, he forced his opponents to react instead of act. And once a pilot is reacting, the psychological balance shifts. Chinese analysts reportedly focused on a single question: how did a maneuver that looked inefficient create hesitation in a superior position? That question mattered. Because modern air combat is no longer decided solely by speed, altitude, or firepower, it's decided by perception. Who sees the situation clearly and who doesn't? In this case, the maneuver exposed a vulnerability not in technology, but in assumptions. Chinese pilots are trained within a highly structured framework. It produces consistency. It produces discipline. But when confronted with something that doesn't fit the framework, the decision-making loop slows, even slightly. And in high-speed aerial encounters, even fractions of a second matter. What made this incident especially significant was that it happened during a controlled exercise. No real weapons, no real casualties, no real escalation, which meant it was studied calmly, without political pressure. And that's often when the most uncomfortable lessons emerge. For the US Air Force, the encounter reinforced a long-standing belief. Air dominance is as much about psychology as it is about machines. For China, it highlighted the challenge of preparing pilots not just for known tactics, but for unpredictability itself. Because no matter how advanced aircraft become, they are still flown by humans. Humans who must decide under pressure. Humans who must interpret incomplete information. Humans who must trust their instincts. And sometimes, doubt enters before danger does. The maneuver didn't win a battle. It didn't prove superiority in a measurable way, but it demonstrated something far more subtle. That in the air, control doesn't always belong to the pilot with more jets, more sensors, or better positioning. Sometimes it belongs to the pilot who understands how the other side thinks and knows exactly when to challenge that thinking. That's why this moment still circulates quietly among pilots and strategists, not as a warning, not as a boast, but as a reminder. In the skies, the most powerful weapon is often the one you never see coming. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more stories about real military encounters, aerial tactics, and the psychology behind modern warfare, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think air combat today is more about technology or the mind of the pilot? And if this story surprised you, check out our other videos exploring moments that quietly reshaped military strategy. See you in the next one.